Nearly all the councils are going to increase council tax bills. In fact, they've already done so. Residents may be imprisoned if there is willful refusal to pay council tax or culpably neglectful. Welcome to Debt Podcast. In this month, I, Ripon Ray, are going to explore prison and council tax. To navigate this month's subject, I have Daw KC. He was called to the bar in 1993 and was appointed King's Counsel in 2013. Before taking silk, Chris built his reputation in the criminal courts, acting in high-profile trials and appeals from serious organized crime to commercial fraud. I also have Russell Hamblin-Boone, Chief Executive Officer for Civil Enforcement Association, CEVIA for short. CEVIA represents nearly 90% of the enforcement agents in the country. So let me start with Daw KC to explore the issues of debt and prison. Chris, the approach to recovering debt feels Dickensian to me. If you do not pay your debt, you end up in prison. Where did the notion of debtor's prison come into play?
Well, good morning. First of all, it's actually now KC since the passing of Her Majesty, sadly, but same principle. But happy to join you. The answer is that we had debtors' prisons in the United Kingdom, in England in particular, in the 19th century and even earlier. And indeed, debtors' prisons were quite a common phenomenon much earlier than that. Going back to Roman times, people could be imprisoned if they didn't pay a private debt. So the idea of imprisoning debtors has been around for a long time, but it became discredited in the 19th and early 20th century because, frankly, the only people who were ever imprisoned were the poor. Rich people who didn't pay their debts inevitably found some other way around the problem, such as leaving the country or doing a deal of some kind. So the idea of being imprisoned for debt has almost always had the greatest impact on the poorest members of our society. So far as council tax in particular is concerned, this was the subject of a huge amount of debate at the time that council tax was introduced in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher's government as to whether there should be a power of imprisonment. And the government at that time decided that there should be a power to imprison as a last resort, and that power exists to this day, albeit, as I'm sure you'll be told in a few minutes, it's not a power that is exercised to its final conclusion very often, but it does exist and it is used frequently as a threat to particularly more marginalised taxpayers and council taxpayers, that they will face that risk if they don't pay. And for me, I think the biggest issue of all is whether we should have this one form of civil debt, because it's not a criminal penalty. It's a form of civil enforcement. Should we have one form of civil debt to local authorities for which you can be imprisoned if you don't pay, whereas for the vast range of other debts that exist in our society, imprisonment is not an option even as a last resort? So should there be something different for council tax? My view is that there shouldn't, for the simple reason that it's not necessary. The costs of trying to make the applications is more than the amount of tax that's ever recovered. And first and foremost, those few people who are sent to prison tend to be the most marginalised individuals, disproportionately female, disproportionately women who have had a partner leave them with a lot of debt, often as a result of an abusive or violent relationship, and often combined with psychological or mental health problems. And those sorts of people don't belong in prisons. They belong in the community, receiving support and assistance from our society. That's my view anyway.
So what was the underlying legislative motive for having such a path?
At the time in the 1980s, we had a government which, of course, was known. The Thatcher government was known for lots of radical and fairly right-wing policies during that decade that she was Prime Minister. And I think the idea of having the stick of potential imprisonment as a last resort appealed to a certain constituency. That why should many people would say, well, if I don't pay my bills, we can't pay for our services, so why should other people be allowed to quote unquote get away with it? So I think there's a lot of political motives at the time. I'm not sure the economics or the fairness or the rationality of it were given as much attention as the political optics at the time, but that was the governmental decision, and of course it's been maintained by every government since, including for many years under a Labour government.
Moving towards the notion of culpable neglect, or willful refusal. What do these words actually mean? Are we going among the realms of can't pay or won't pay?
Well, I think the truth is that they're ordinary English phrases, and yes, there's an interpretation placed upon them by the courts, but I think most people can understand what the terms mean. The difficulty is that you have people often with the final summons or warrant for imprisonment being issued before they've even really managed to understand what's going on. And I made a television program a few years ago for the BBC where we looked at this very issue of imprisonment for council tax, and we found a number of examples of particularly women who have been through the most horrific experiences and ended up going to prison purely because they couldn't cope mentally or psychologically with the process, and that was interpreted by the courts as being a willful refusal to pay. In many of the cases characterized as willful refusal, the truth is it's either an incapability to deal with life, with money, with the pressures of psychological and psychiatric conditions, rather than a conscious and deliberate decision not to pay this one specific debt out of all others.
What is the legal process for getting to committal to prison for non-payment of council tax?
Well, it comes about after a number of other stages. There are a number of other applications in the magistrates' court to try to enforce the council tax, as I'm sure you'll hear more from Russell about that process. But in the end, the local authority has to make an application to the magistrates for a warrant of imprisonment based on the statutory criteria which apply. And that's one of the major problems, because as you'll appreciate, there are many local authorities. And we found out when we were doing some research around this a couple of years ago for one of the campaigns I was involved in, that 2/3 of the local authorities in the country have never applied to commit anyone to prison at all, because they haven't had the candidates perhaps who they thought qualified, but actually more so because they took the policy decision as a council that we won't apply for these warrants because we don't believe in them and we don't believe people should be sent to prison. And the difficulty that means is that you could be living in one local authority area on one side of the road in Britain, and you could potentially be subject of an application to send you to prison. If you lived on the other side of the road and it just happened to be a different local authority area, you've got no danger at all. And in a country like the UK and in a country like England and Wales, where there's a single legal jurisdiction, you would have thought that there should be consistency and fairness wherever you live. You shouldn't be treated differently if you don't pay your council tax in Newcastle than you would be if you lived in London or Exeter. And that, for me, is one of the fundamental problems with the system, is that there is no consistency whatsoever. Some councils make huge numbers of applications, others make none. And that, to me, just seems completely unfair.
In terms of fairness, and also we know that different countries in the UK have different policies around it, such as Scotland and Wales. What are their reasons for abolishing imprisonment?
Well, I'm not going to comment on Scotland. No, I'm not a Scottish lawyer. I do know that imprisonment isn't available in Scotland for non-payment of council tax. That was a political decision. It was a decision taken at political level under the devolved powers of the Scottish Assembly and the Scottish government, that they, as a country and they, as a government, were not prepared to send people to prison in Scotland for what, in almost any other walk of life, would be a civil wrong, which would result in civil proceedings only, possibly bailiffs, of course, at the ultimate end of any civil debt process. There could be bailiffs involved to seize goods, but at the end of any other civil process, the one thing that isn't going to happen is that you get sent to prison.
If there is to be a change in the current framework, since a number of committal to prison are in their tents, what is the legal process for going through that?
It's very straightforward. The legislation which established council tax, which has, of course, been amended over the years a number of times by different governments and at different times, you simply amend the legislation to remove the power, the ultimate power, to apply for and grant a warrant of detention. If that power is removed from the statute books, you will be left with all of the other enforcement powers, up to and including bailiffs and up to including bankruptcy, ultimately, as can happen with any unpaid debt. But at no stage, if that very simple amendment was made, would anybody be threatened, and often threatened with no real basis, that they'll be sent to prison in correspondence. You could be sent to prison. Well, yeah, but you probably won't be. And also, what these letters should be saying is, we are concerned about your welfare, because many, as I say, many non-payers are they are not won't payers, they are can't payers, or they are simply, they lack the life skills necessary to navigate paperwork, documents, particularly if they're involved in all sorts of other life stresses. And you just have to accept that in the end, people, generally speaking, they're not, even if they are willful, the crime, if you want to call it that, because as I say, it's not a crime, but the crime of non-paying a bill is not a crime which in any other walk of life gets you locked up in a jail cell.
Has there been any legal cases or legal issues around council tax recovery in recent times?
Well, I think the issue has been, there've been a number actually. There've been a number of issues of principle, in other words, whether it's in principle correct, and in certain cases, applications to commit to prison have been set aside by the High Courts, and by the High Court in particular, where the magistrates have not followed the process correctly. But the biggest legal issue of all is that councils are often making these applications without going through the proper process and without giving any consideration or wider consideration to whether it's actually a good idea, whether it's going to make, in the end, the purpose of council tax enforcement is single-fold. It's not to punish non-payers, it's to increase the rate of payment. And councils across the country have been criticised, some of them for massive applications, hundreds or thousands at once in a single court, or many of which have been decided on the nod without any consideration of the detail and with no one there to act for or speak for the defendant in those cases. So there have been serious criticisms in the High Court of process, and there have been serious criticisms in a number of cases about the very principle of whether people in a society like ours, which is a society bound by basic principles of human rights, should actually be imprisoning the poorest people in our society, some of the most marginalised people, women in particular, for something which isn't even a crime.
Do you want to get rid of the rule, and why?
Well, absolutely. I can't see any justification for selecting one debt. Why council tax? Why not if you don't pay your electricity bill, you can get sent to prison, or any other bill for a utility or a basic service which everybody has and which people want to use in our society. Of course, we do have a similar provision, irrationally, for television licenses of all things, whereby there is a power to imprison for non-payment of a television license, even for someone who's never watched the BBC and never has any intention of watching the BBC, still required to have a television license and still potentially could be sent to prison if they refuse to pay. So we do have a couple of strange outlying examples like council tax and like television licenses, but for the vast majority of other commitments that we have, whether to the public purse, in terms of tax, for example, if you don't pay your income tax, if you don't pay it on time, or if you don't have the money to pay it in full, all that can happen to you is that you get sued, you get taken to court, your goods can be taken off of you, and you can be made bankrupt. And I say all because that's a catastrophic sequence of events for anyone. But there is, at the end of that process, even for very large debts of income tax or other debts, unless there is fraud involved, there is no prospect of someone being sent to prison simply because they don't pay.
Thank you, Chris, Daw KC. Let me speak to Russell Hamblin-Boone. What is your thought on committal to prison? Do you think we are still living in a Dickensian period when it comes to the recovery of council tax?
Well, I think, Ripon, we've heard that it's not straightforward. It's not, it's not an easy debate to polarise. I can understand why there are such strong feelings about council tax and council tax collection. Council tax itself is a regressive tax. It means that people on low incomes pay more proportionally than people that earn more and live in more expensive houses. And there's no question that the legislation is lagging behind the system and the way things work now, and is in desperate need of reform. But I disagree with those who think council tax collection practices are outdated. I would challenge those people to take a detailed look at what's actually involved. Council tax collection uses enforcement agents in complex, highly specialised and essential work that's needed to recover lost revenue for local and central government. And it helps to sustain our vital public services while continuing to deliver the referrals, the advice and the support for people who are in debt. For example, we collect around £1 billion a year in unpaid council tax after the councils have sought to pursue unpaid arrears themselves. And we know from independent analysis that if there was light touch collection, there'd be a loss of up to £12 billion in council tax payments alone each year by those people who no longer had an incentive to pay. But civil enforcement is much more than just collecting debts. We've got a unique role in supporting councils to identify and signpost welfare support cases. If you take last year alone, enforcement agents identified 351,000 people that were vulnerable, but the council had no information about. So I think even our harshest critics would have to concede that's impressive work that has no cost to the taxpayer and a huge cost to society, a huge benefit to society.
So Chris Daw KC spoke about the recovery stages before it gets to a case where prison is an issue. At what stage would an enforcement agent get involved in the legal process? Are we talking about 3 months have passed once a liability order has been obtained, or what? How does it work?
Yeah, so as you say, the entire process of council tax collection is a legal process. And the option of committal to prison is one small part of that process. Briefly, the process the council follows is this. Having set the council tax rate for the following year, each local authority is required to issue an annual demand notice, which sets out how the charge is calculated, and it gives us permission to be able to pay in instalments of 10 or 12 months. The bill is due on the 1st of April, but the councils allow us longer to pay it. If you don't pay it, your council will give you a reminder notice, giving you 7 days if you missed a payment. If you don't pay within 7 days, you will owe the full amount of the council tax bill for that year. But you will be sent a second reminder notice if you miss another council tax payment. And if you miss 3 payments, you'll get a final notice saying the whole amount is due and there are no other options. And the council may take legal action to get the tax you owe. The council can then go to a magistrate and ask for a liability order. And that's a legal demand for payment. And the council may add its legal costs to the money that you owe. And councils have got additional powers under a liability order, including things like deduction from earnings, deductions from benefits, charging orders on the property, bankruptcy, and the option of enforcement agents or bailiffs as they're commonly known. If a council applies for committal to prison, the court must inquire into the debtor's means, and the council must satisfy the court that there's no other effective method of collection and that failure to pay, as Chris said, is due to willful refusal or culpable neglect. And that's to prevent people who are genuinely unable to pay their council tax from being committed to prison. As I said, the council can use enforcement agents and seize your property if there's no other option, no other way to recover your debt. But the bailiff's costs can also be added to the total amount you owe the council. So you can be sent to prison for up to 3 months if the court decides you don't have a good reason to not pay your council tax and you continue to refuse to do so. And there are many stages and many opportunities for that to be reviewed for you to make your case. And often the figures that are quoted are committal numbers. Individual cases where there's been a committal to prison doesn't necessarily mean someone actually being imprisoned, because very often payment is resolved before it gets to that stage, which is why since 2020 there have been 4 cases of committal, none of them resulting in anyone going to prison. That's because the threat of prison is a strong incentive for people to pay what they owe their council.
I mean, what dialogue do enforcement agent company would have with local council before it gets to an agent?
There are official and unofficial processes for dialogue. One of the things that's happening more recently is before we get into the statutory process, enforcement firms are working with councils to see if they can make contact with people, not to collect their debt, simply to get a dialogue going, simply to understand their circumstances, to get some information about those people, because very often councils don't have anything more than a name and address. And so we're starting from a very limited amount of information. So they work with enforcement firms at what is a stage that's increasingly popular, which is a pre-compliance stage. And that's a very good opportunity where people aren't under any other obligation than to identify themselves. And very often we can identify vulnerability that way. The first formal stage of the process is the compliance stage. That was introduced 10 years ago in an effort to get earlier engagement. And that stage has been transformed by enforcement firms who are seeking to engage debtors and to identify vulnerability. Alongside assessing income and expenditure, they'll be looking to maximize income, looking at people's benefits on benefits calculators, looking to look at their ability to pay, whether they can get sustainable repayment plans in place. And enforcement firms have invested heavily in identifying, analysing and communicating with people who fall into what the collections firms would call the hard to collect category. And enforcement firms are leading the way in the use of this innovative technology. The compliance stage technically is 14 days. It can run for much longer, up to 28, 30 days before we move to the visit stage, and around 40% of the debt is collected at that stage without the need for there to be an enforcement agent to visit. So I often see debt collection agencies being held up as a model of responsible debt resolution, but many of the good practices of that sector are absolutely integral to modern enforcement practice. And, say it quietly, but there are elements in which enforcement agents are leading the way in the world of debt recovery and resolution, unpopular as that theory that may be.
Well, we are speaking about the cost of fuel going up, water bills going up, council tax have gone up. On top of that increase, we're also talking about extra charge of enforcement agents. How do you feel about that?
Well, I need to correct you there, Ripon. There have been no increases in the fees that enforcement agents charge. The fee they charge has been frozen for over 10 years. Now, I don't think you could name many sectors, private or public, that have been unable to adjust their charges for over a decade. And it's a purely political decision by successive governments that have exploited enforcement agents due to their sort of inherent unpopularity, I suppose, and they haven't reviewed fees annually against inflationary costs as set out in the regulations. So there's been no increase for over 10 years. But enforcement firms are paid according to a fixed fee structure that's set by the Ministry of Justice, and they can't recover any fees for unpaid debts. And I do think that if the government doesn't act soon, all of the great investment, all of the technology that's been developed and the excellent work that enforcement agents do for local authorities are going to be cut back, and we'll all be paying much higher bills to cover the loss of revenue to councils.
I'm not arguing for the abolition of enforcement agents, and no doubt debt charities have been reporting about malpractice. What remedies do they have to challenge the behavior of enforcement agents?
Charities will always report malpractice. Unfortunately, they rarely have the evidence, and it's even more rare for them to lodge a formal complaint. So it's quite difficult to investigate the evidence. Just as an example, the Enforcement Conduct Board conducted an independent analysis of 650 body-worn video recordings from a cross-section of firms to check that enforcement agents were behaving properly and they were complying with the government standards. They found that in 94% of cases, all the rules were being met. In the remaining 6%, the breaches were minor, things like data protection and minor infringements. There were no instances in which they observed enforcement agents discriminating against individuals. There was one video where there was an incident in which the behaviour of the enforcement agent was deemed to be threatening. That's clearly unacceptable. That was reported to the firm and dealt with. We've got the Enforcement Conduct Board now, and I would say to any charities that make allegation against enforcement firms of malpractice to, don't hide behind data protection and privacy rules. Do the right thing. Report the cases with strong evidence so that they can be investigated. I think if there was any genuine evidence of systemic problems, we'd want to see those cases of poor practice so that we can investigate. You can draw your own conclusions whether there are systemic problems or not, just from the fact that there's never really any strong evidence that's presented. And I think often it's a dislike of the laws as opposed to any systemic problems in the way enforcement firms are acting.
I mean, I think that's a somewhat strange response, because you've just said that 6% of body-worn footage, so that's where people are actually being videoed. 6%, and they know the video is switched on. 6% included rule breaches, and you just said they included minor matters such as data protection. Data protection is absolutely fundamental. Is it the position of the association that data protection breaches by enforcement agents are minor matters, as you've just said, Russell?
Yeah, so what it could mean is that an enforcement agent is talking to someone on the doorstep, and the analyst has noticed somebody walk past on the pavement or whatever, and so rather than the enforcement agent stopping speaking, for example, the analyst has judged that actually that could be overheard, so potentially that's a data protection infringement. It's not sort of giving out information to all and sundry, or not sort of but things that happen in real life when you're talking to people, particularly if someone said, I'd rather you didn't come into the house, can we discuss it on the doorstep? Enforcement agents have to be extra careful. Obviously, they've got to give people certain information. They sometimes have to be careful how they give that information. And we provide training, but very often, in real life, people act differently than the kind of the textbooks and things like that.
I mean, I think, Ripon, the truth is that we can't have private companies involved in enforcing what goes on in the public sector in the way that happens here. It's completely inappropriate that it's a profit-making activity. Only the poorest 10% of the population are affected in any significant way by all of this. And the whole idea that there are enforcement agents on someone's doorstep calling them out because they haven't paid a debt whilst there are members of the public walking past, and that is seen by Russell as being just a minor inconvenience, that they happen to have accidentally breached someone's absolute right to privacy in their financial affairs. It tells you all you need to know about the problems in our society, that we are putting money into private sector hands to conduct activity that should only be conducted properly and proportionally by the state, and that, I'm afraid, is just another example of where we've gone wrong. And the fact that to maintain the power to imprison is even more frightening. That a private organisation is collecting debts and using the threat of prison on doorsteps to get people to pay. People they have no idea about their mental health, no idea about their well-being, no idea if they are in an abusive relationship behind the door and someone else is taking money from them, because they can't know those things, because they're not trained in those things. And they shouldn't be there at all. It's as simple as that.
That's not correct, Chris. And I'd be very happy for you to come out on the streets and shadow enforcement agents in their work.
I'm sure they behave themselves with me watching.
And see how difficult the work is. They are very highly trained to spot vulnerability. As you said, councils have no idea about anybody until they actually send someone out on the doorstep. And I've been out with them, and then you can see the circumstances people are living in. You can talk through the support that we can give them, how they can be referred back to the council.
But are your people trained in psychology, mental health, and in mental health disorders, and the symptoms of abuse and the symptoms of being in controlling coercive relationships? Because if they are, they're better trained than most police officers, frankly.
Yeah, because when you visit people,
staggered if the training goes anywhere near what will be required to make an accurate assessment on the doorstep just by one conversation as to whether someone is in a position of considerable danger or difficulty in their life.
You'll be very surprised at what people will disclose when they have an opportunity to not talk to a bot or a contact center agent or an email or a text, when they can actually talk to somebody who's sympathetic, empathetic, understanding of their situation, and is there to help them resolve a problem. How much they will talk to you about the situation they're in, and which is great, because then we've got a whole backstory which we can use to help them resolve that situation. And very often we can do other things as well.
You're only thinking about making money from those who are struggling financially. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the government has chosen to use private firms because of the professionalism they can bring, because of the investment they're able to bring to this really important work. I think that it's the scrutiny that they come under, particularly now that we've voluntarily set up an independent body to oversee our work, to audit firms, to provide an adjudication process, shows that there's a lot more to it than simply the collection process. The performance and the standards and the conduct that we have to achieve is all part of the sort of the checks and measures that are in place to ensure that firms are meeting high standards, because they're working for councils who are equally responsible to residents. It would be a huge risk to do anything to jeopardize that relationship.
Thank you, Russell. I mean, my panel members are going to provide top tips to Debt Talk listeners, either to take the course of imprisonment and council tax at another level. So let me start with Daw KC. What is your thoughts on ways to move forward to address the issue of imprisonment?
I think it's one of those areas where, and Russell probably won't thank me for saying this, but where technology is the answer. AI is the answer to the analysis of non-payment of debts and the patterns, geographical patterns, the local patterns, the inputs of other information that local authorities may have. If you put all of the information available in relation to the process, you will find that many of these cases which are pursued to a point where the costs of pursuing them are far greater. And if you think about sending someone to prison, sending someone to prison for a month costs about £4,000 or thereabouts. So the whole idea that there would be any rational basis to ever send anyone to prison to recover a debt that's significantly lower than the cost of putting them in prison simply makes no sense in this day and age. We need to have a joined up approach to the public finances and to the collection of taxes up and down the country, which doesn't depend on the whims of one local authority which decides it wants to issue thousands of applications in this area, and another local authority which quite properly decides that it's not appropriate and it's an immoral way to behave with the collection of debts from those very vulnerable people that it affects disproportionately. So I think we use technology, but we also have to apply a bit of common sense and humanity. And I don't say this with disrespect, but I understand Russell has a commercial interest to serve. But truth be told, society doesn't need the sorts of services that Russell's members are providing. It needs to have a government of sympathetic, decent, but also pragmatic decision making, where processes and procedures don't cause people to come to the brink of mental health breakdown, suicide, or being in prison. And I'm afraid that has happened so many times over the last 30 or 40 years that it just needs to finally come to an end.
And finally, Russell Hamblin-Boone from Syria.
Yeah, well, as I said, it hasn't happened in the last 5 years. We have introduced independent oversight of our industry. Chris will be pleased to know that all of the things he's talking about there, AI, data analysis, segmentation, profiling, all of those things are employed in partnership with councils to make sure that we're able to identify people's circumstances, communicate with them in the appropriate way according to those circumstances, if you like, addressing the can't pays differently to the won't pays, and applying the full forces of the law that we have to ensure that those who won't pay, those who are culpably neglectful, willingly refusing to pay, are able to do so. And that way we won't get to the situation that's been estimated of £12 billion unpaid council tax. We currently have £6 billion of unpaid council tax. So it seems that we have, with a 97% collection rate, a pretty good council tax collection system. After all, this is tax, and we are required to pay our tax by law. If we don't do that, those of us who do pay will be subsidising those of us who don't pay to much higher levels, and council tax will be putting up their council taxes even higher for us to subsidise those who are evading payment and the efforts of enforcement agents.
I want to thank my panel members, Chris, Daw KC and Russell Hamblin-Boone, for giving their precious time out of their busy schedule. Without their input, Debt Talk could not be carried and be where it is. I'm also grateful to Debt Talk listeners for providing the feedback. My next podcast is going to be on the insecurities of being self-employed. Thank you for listening to Debt Talk podcast with me, your host, Ripon Ray.